Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's brilliant to see so many here. Welcome to this discussion about the work programme. This is the first in a series of seminars which are going to be jointly held by Policy Exchange, by the Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion. Now, all of you know that welfare reform is a big issue last week. It seems like welfare reform is a big issue this week. And here we are talking about one of the most exciting issues moving in politics at the moment. For those of you who don't know, Policy Exchange is a think tank which looks at all different aspects of how to improve public policy. We work on health, education, crime, the environment, the economy, and over the last year we've become increasingly interested in welfare reform, publishing a number of papers. We've got more in the pipeline. We're absolutely delighted to be partnering up with Inclusion. We do brilliant work in this area, and we hope that all of you will carry on joining us as we work through all these different issues. We have some great speakers here today to talk about these things, and to introduce them, I'm going to hand over to Dave Simmons from Inclusion.
Thank you, Neil, and indeed I hope that this series of 3 seminars that we're doing at Policy Exchange will still really try and broaden out the debate as we move forward into what will be a critical period for the success or otherwise of welfare reform. And of course what we're concentrating here today is on the work programme. And just this morning, Chris Grayling on the Today programme, as well as IDS on a persistent basis, stresses that the work programme is an absolute linchpin for the wider welfare reform. In other words, that it's all well and good reforming the actual nature of the benefits themselves, but at the same time, you also have to reform the actual employment support to benefit claimants to maximise their chances of getting not just into a job, but into a sustainable job. And that's what the work programme is all about. And at the Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion, we focus on welfare to work issues, and certainly we have always been in favour of a single work programme, of universal access by all claimants to employment support to help them break dependency and get into sustainable jobs. But let's be under no illusions just how big a challenge the work programme actually is. Our estimates is that by 2014, certainly by the time all of the existing IB claimants have been reassessed, hot topic of debate today, the work programme could reach over 2 million claimants on it. That is indeed, will be the largest ever programme that we've had in this country, and I suspect that Chris Grayling was right this morning when he said it will be the largest programme ever attempted across the world. And as such, it is a big risk, it is a big challenge, but it is the right risk and the right challenge. Of course, there are 3 key challenges where we stand today, and we're going to look at these 3 with our speakers today. But at round about, approximately, we are told, 1:30, Lord Freud will be joining us. The time that he has with us is shrinking by the minute. Apparently now we have about 15 minutes when he'll address us, but then unfortunately it looks like he won't have time for a Q&A, but you never know. Ministers very often relent when faced with such an audience. So, we should also remember, as we're speaking today, that actually in this room today we've got a very wide range of knowledge and experience about the work programme. Some of you here today will be actively engaged and are actively engaged already in delivering programmes, and some would have bidded already, whereas others are here to really just catch up on what the latest state of affairs is. So where are we now with the work programme? Well, just was it a week ago, 2 weeks ago, the bids for the regional frameworks to run the work programme were submitted. We'll know the results of those bids at the end of November. And of course, those organisations that submitted bids range from very substantial multinational companies through to smaller voluntary organisations and charities. But it is fair to say that there is a lot of movement out there at the moment, with different companies teaming up together to create the right sort of capacity and capability to deliver this challenge. So, the three challenges that face us. Obviously, the one criticism that is always thrown at the work programme is, will there be the jobs there? It's all well and good saying that we're going to give universal support to all claimants, find a job, something which hasn't existed before. All well and good, but will there be the jobs for the providers to help claimants find that job that will get them off benefits? And to help us answer that question, we've got John Philpott, who many of you will know as the Chief Economist at CPID and a frequent commentator on that sort of bigger picture of the labour market, employment policy issues, and I think probably widely used in terms of your predictions, John, as to where unemployment is going in the future. So that's challenge number one. Will there be the jobs? Challenge number two. Will there be the finance? This is going to be the largest programme ever, but where on earth, in a period of retrenchment and public sector expenditure reductions, where on earth is the finance coming from? Well, there you have to go back to some very, very clear words contained within the coalition agreement. And I'll quote them, just in case we tend to forget what is actually in that coalition agreement and the script for this government. It says, we will reform the funding mechanism used by government to finance welfare to work programmes to reflect the fact that initial investment delivers later savings through lower benefit expenditure, including creating an integrated work programme with outcome funding based upon the DEL AME switch. Now, I'm not going to describe to you today. You'll be glad to know what the DEL AME switch actually means. Suffice it to say that there is a lot of anguished discussions at the moment between Treasury and DWP on exactly what it means and how much funding will be released. But in effect, the programme is intended to be funded through increased job outcomes that otherwise would not have been the case. In other words, it is invest to save. And to look at the finance implications of that, we have Richard Johnson from Circa. And then the final challenge that we need to look at is the whole issue of delivery. Delivery. If the expectation by government is that they want increased job outcomes over and above what they would have had anyway, and that's what they're prepared to pay for, if that is the case, then clearly our whole infrastructure of the work programme has to be performing better than it has been before. And therefore, performance around securing those job outcomes and making sure people are staying in job not just for 2 months, 3 months, but 6 months, 1 year longer, more sustainable job outcomes, that is indeed a very significant delivery challenge to all of our providers. But it's even more difficult than that, because the key group that is getting support and access to employment support for the first time are all of those that used to be or still are on incapacity benefit, who have never received that sort of support before. And as that group gets transferred over and into the work programme, one of the big unknowns is how do we provide that employment support to those people with health-related problems. It hasn't been done before, and let me assure you, it is one of the knowns unknowns. And to help us look at the range of delivery issues, we've got Martin Dunford, who's the Chief Exec of Skills Training UK, and is also Chairman of the Association of Learning Providers. So, that I hope sets the scene. Let me assure you there is no doubt of the political aspiration with the work programme, but we also have to make sure collectively that there is also the appetite by providers, appetite by financiers to be putting that cash up front to make it a success and to deliver the volumes that I've talked about. So, to kick us off with looking at the wider jobs market, are there the jobs there? We're going to ask John Philpott to talk first, and as and when David Freud joins us, the instructions to the panel, whoever's up here is let on the minister, and then we'll carry on and pick up where we left off. So, John, thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks very much, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. Just judging by the introduction, I hope that job opportunities in the economy don't shrink as much as Lord Freud's available time this afternoon. I'm going to talk specifically about what would essentially be the likely effectiveness of a supply-side policy at a time when the distinguishing issue for the UK economy is actually what is happening to both aggregate demand and also demand at a regional level. I've said throughout the run-up to the recession and during it that despite sort of obvious need for welfare reform, actually the underlying supply side of the UK labour market is functioning pretty well, and whatever level of unemployment we actually reached, if we were to have a decent improvement in demand, a fairly strong recovery, one would expect to see unemployment fall quite quickly. And indeed, I took as evidence of that the spring bounce in employment that we saw earlier in the year, where we had this record increase in private sector employment, enabling unemployment to move on to a slightly downward path, and I think that indicates what could happen if we are to get a decent recovery. The question is, will we get a decent recovery? Now, probably the best place to start is the OBR benchmark forecast for between now and the middle of the decade. That suggests that unemployment has already peaked and will fall over time to around 2 million, still more than most people would think was a good level of unemployment. But if over this period of time and at the end of the fiscal consolidation, we actually have had continually falling unemployment and reached 2 million unemployed, not only will I be out on the streets campaigning for Cameron, Clegg and Osborne, but I will be going to Westminster Cathedral down the road and suggest that they ought to be canonised, because I think that will be the sort of scale of the miracle that will have been pulled off. What's much more likely to happen, I think, is that we're going to have at least 2 or 3 years of fairly anemic growth at best. Unemployment's going to rise. And then after that, I think we'll get a decent-ish recovery with unemployment falling again. That might be nicely timed for the election, so perhaps there'll be smiling faces all round, notwithstanding. But in the meantime, I think that the job situation is going to be very difficult, and operating the work programme in that context will be correspondingly difficult too. In addition, one needs to point out that that's talking about the aggregate labour market situation. I think the private sector job growth that we will undoubtedly see in net terms at some point between now and 2015 will, other things being equal, be primarily sort of seen in the southern half of the UK, with limited progress in the what you might call the north and the depressed regions. There are possibilities that the situation could be better in those areas. We know that some aspects of government are directed at job creation in those areas, and it's not inconceivable, although I think unlikely, that as the argument would go, there's some amount of crowding out of private sector jobs as a result of high public spending, high taxes and high regulation in those areas of the country that might alleviate some of the strain. But I think that is unlikely, and it therefore means that we need to be sober and realistic in our expectations as to what the work programme can achieve. Not least because it is not only a supply side measure, but it's actually probably more of a supply side measure than the existing suite of government programmes that it will be replacing, at least some of them, of which, if you're looking at things like the Future Jobs Fund and the Youth Job Guarantee, were also trying to create additional demand in some of these places. Now, what do we know about work programmes in times of adversity? We know not only that it's more difficult to operate them, but we also know that it's actually more important to operate them and put a great deal more stress on them. Because even in tough times, there is a continual turnover of vacancies, and it's important to ensure that the jobless are competitive for those vacancies vis-a-vis other people in our labour market and or potential migrant workers who could take those jobs. And therefore I support strongly the emphasis that the government's placing on the work programme and the need to strive forward with that and the shift towards universal credit. I think anybody would be sort of mad not to say that should be happening. Where I think we have to be realistic is that what does this mean for likely job entry rates? What does it mean for likely sustainability rates? And by extension, what does that mean in terms of the financing and budgetary arrangements for the work programme itself? I won't go into the latter details, but I think my conclusion essentially is that it means that job entry will be much more difficult, particularly in areas where demand for labour is quite weak. And also, and I think this is a point worth reiterating, at such times you're likely to see job vacancies occurring in two different sorts of ways. One is at the higher skill end, where, and you know, I don't want to be dismissive of jobless people, but on the whole, they are not the sorts of vacancies that many jobless people can fill quickly or easily. At the other end of the spectrum, you tend still to see quite a lot of vacancies of a high turnover nature, which are in that situation largely because of their poor characteristics and conditions. Now these of course will be potential vacancies for work programme participants, and I think it's vital that we ensure that not just JSA people, but people on all the other sorts of benefits are if pushed as appropriate into those vacancies. But by their very nature, a lot of those jobs are going to be high turnover, fast turnover, and therefore the sustainability criteria of the programme might be difficult to secure. That's why I think it's going to be important to flex this, so that when we're talking about sustainability, we're not talking about sustainability in a given job, but sustainability of an individual in a succession of short-term jobs. And it is likely to be a succession of short-term jobs. One reason being that as well as being high turnover at this time, a lot of employers will be slightly reluctant, to say the least, to spend considerable amounts investing in skills and development. And so opportunities for progressing up the job ladder in those sorts of jobs will probably be worse than it already is. I think I'll conclude there. So, you know, just to say, I think the job situation will get worse. I'm not the worst of pessimists. I don't think we're going to get a double-dip recession, and I don't think we're going to get more than 3 million unemployed, but I think we're going to get close to that. The situation is going to be pretty tough, and before good times roll, the work programme is going to have to confront quite a lot of potential pitfalls and difficulties. And what we must ensure, and I think this is something that would really be a message that should run across the political spectrum, is that we shouldn't use the difficulty that the work programme will face as an excuse for rubbishing it. I think a lot of the principles are sound. I think a lot of the basic philosophy is sound. And if there are problems confronted in the programme which aren't related to its design but are related to those that stem from its context, then that should be acknowledged, and we should look at how it can be built, because the ultimate task here is not about whether one programme is better than another, but it's to ensure that some of the most disadvantaged people in our country are given the opportunity to work and the ability to get back into jobs of the kind that will give them long-run and sustainable careers. And I'll stop.
We should have time if there are any sort of questions, quick questions or contributions, or anybody indeed who would want to disagree with John's slightly rosy view of the world in terms of at least no double dip. There is one there. Is there anybody else? Let's see. These two in front. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Fred Turon. I'm chairman of a charity called TAG that will place by next year, we're on target to place 2,000 NEETs into full-time employment. I think it is incumbent on us all to be creative. Whilst I recognise what you say in terms of employment and employment sustainability, what is crucial is that we look at the funding investment for skills to target specifically deprived areas, and in particular areas such as health. Because what we know, we need joined up government here. What we need is to say, let's look at the big picture macro issues that are affecting our economy. Health is one of the biggest. We have an obesity epidemic. If we now link taking needs, taking unemployed, linking skills training, doing it in the community, for the community, by the community, thereby we can actually create a much bigger win here than just jobs for jobs' sake. So I would be interested to hear whether the panel or you agree with that.
Yeah, okay, and shall we take...
It's Harriet Sargent, I'm a journalist. I think it's 1.7 million jobs that have been created in the last 12 years. 80% of them have gone to immigrants. What is going to stop companies in the future using immigrants rather than people who are generally more highly trained?
Well, it's known, but in my view on migration has always been very clear that letting in the Eastern Europeans was at the levels that we did was a mistake. We already have enough unskilled people in our society to fill those vacancies. We can't do anything about that. That situation is gone. We are effectively capping unskilled migration. So the more we can do that, the better. It's still a problem that we can't prevent Europeans coming into our economy to fill unskilled jobs. So that, again, that's something that we've got to live with. As for the overall migration cap on skilled workers, I think in principle that idea is flawed because it's largely unworkable. But by the same token, I think it's wrong of employers simply to plead the special case that they must have all the skilled migrants that they want at a time when we're still not investing enough in skills in our own country. So I think what we need is what you might call the de facto cap, which is essentially flexing the current point system, identifying those employers where they ought to be making a bigger contribution to training and clamping down on that, and then being more permissive towards those employers who really can't in any circumstances quickly or easily fill the vacancies that are in. So I think on that score we need a slightly more subtle and sophisticated debate on the migration question and how that relates to jobs. And I know it's politically incorrect to say so. Gordon Brown is lambasted for talking about British jobs for British workers because the BNP used that slogan, but quietly, in essence, that's what we all want. We want to get British people who are lacking skills and lacking jobs, filling the vacancies that we're creating. And that's not only just good for our economy, but it's also good for reducing the deficit itself.
How about Fred's point about looking at the macro picture, how we focus on deprived areas, integrating skills training for NEETs and unemployed people?
I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. That's the sort of thing that we should be doing. I fear, however, that again, the government ministers talk constantly about fairness, cuts, spending budgetary squeeze to go to be fair. I think if you look historically, and this isn't a particularly political point as such, but wherever government squeeze like this, it's actually the disadvantaged communities and the people at the bottom who suffer most. So I suspect the situation we might be in is a lot of people will agree with what you say. The government will say we can't actually afford it, and then they'll point to other bodies within the big society to fill the gap. And if you're in a deprived community where there is a sort of kind of a cluster of big society operators that want to fill that gap, they will. If not, you're up a particular sort of stream without a paddle, and that's, I think, a situation that some communities are going to be in.
One last quick comment before we move to our next speaker.
I'm Gordon Keeman from the National Housing Federation. I'm interested in and perhaps some of the other speakers will allow a description. We have a work programme which actually isn't designed to create the demand side work as other work programmes in previous times have. Obviously I represent a sector. As a sector we need houses. One of the initial changes in the housing benefit in London shortly will be 86,000 people on threat of being removed from their houses. What houses will they go to and how will we deal with that? But I'm interested in, you mentioned the upward move there in the employment field there, 285,000 jobs created in the last quarter, I think it was, that was recorded, but only 8,000 people were removed from the unemployment, the official unemployment register, I think it was. On that basis, the work programme would need to find some 40 million jobs to remove 2 million people from the task in hand, or I got the figures wrong. I'm interested to see how the work programme is going to create jobs. Yes, we can sweat the assets, but we have other assets. Taking on the gentleman's point about other sectors, the Germans have done it with the green products and building photovoltaics for their homes, etc. They've created an industry in 10 years, but I don't hear any expression of expenditure in those areas. And I'm wondering, I'm concerned that we're going to sweat the labour and not create the jobs. Previous work programmes created employment opportunities, or at least created a platform of employment opportunities, perhaps in building houses, perhaps in building train stations, perhaps in building roads.
Okay, so your point is to whether or not work programme is actually, is it job creation? Should it be job creation?
I think it won't. I suppose you need to distinguish between job creation for jobless people who would otherwise be excluded from those opportunities, or job creation for the economy as a whole. Essentially, it can't create additional work as such. What it's about is ensuring that the jobless fill available vacancies, so it can increase their employment rate, but doesn't have an impact on the overall employment rate. It could, at times, if there was obviously I don't want to get too technical about this, but if there was a big inflation problem, wage inflation problem in the labour market that was preventing demand, then doing this by increasing the effective supply of labour would actually allow the economy to grow faster, and that would help create more jobs. That was the philosophy behind the original New Deals in the 1990s. But we don't have, I know it's odd to talk about it when you've got 2.5 million unemployed, but we don't have a big labour market problem. We've got a big macroeconomic problem and a lack of demand, and that going forward is actually what is going to be the main issue for the country to confront in the next few years. But as I said, that's not an excuse for doing less on the supply side. It's actually an argument for doing more, both to ensure that people who are at the bottom of the pile have opportunities in the short run, but also to ensure that they are employable over the longer run, because once that demand constraint is taken away, and we do have a much tighter labour market, then the effects of those kinds of policies will come to their fore. And you can see this because a lot of good things that are done under the Thatcherites in the 80s, and to some extent as well by New Labour in the 90s and in this decade. You didn't see the fruits of them immediately. You saw the fruits of them subsequently when there was continued growth without inflation of the kind that we'd suffered and experienced.
Just one thing.
Okay.
Unemployment is 8 million.
Yep.
Unregistered unemployment in the country is 8 million. We are talking here about the registered unemployed or incapacity benefit. The difference is when 285,000 jobs were created, the majority of those went to be unregistered unemployed. Is that correct, gentlemen?
No, again, I think actually this is interesting because government ministers have been highlighting this. Well, we're in that sort of early stage for government where it's actually in your interest to rubbish everything that went before so that you can make a strong case for what you're intending to do. There's a tendency for government ministers at the moment to rubbish some of the effective policies being operated by their own department. Because there's a big flow of vacancies all the time, and the stock of unemployment is continually churning. Actually, hundreds of thousands of people are coming off JSA and other benefits all the time. It's simply that the sort of stock levels of jobs in the economy as a whole isn't enough to sort of mop up the jobless. But the welfare system needs to be improved. I think you'd have to be a mug not to say that there aren't significant problems that need to be addressed. But compared to where we were 20, 30 years ago, the welfare state or the active welfare system works a lot better than it did. And I think governments of various stripes going back over that period ought to take some credit. I think the important thing is not to rubbish where we've been in the past, but to say there are good things in our current approach and we need to build them.
Okay, thank you, John, and actually perfect timing because welcome to Lord David Freud, who has just got about 15 minutes to be with us, so we'll get him straight onto the platform. Many of you will know that David is the architect of the work programme, indeed under the previous administration, but obviously especially now. But actually his brief now is a far broader one in terms of looking across the entirety of welfare reform. So it's with special thanks, David, that you're able to come here today to specifically talk about the work programme. David.
Right, oh, standing room only, fantastic. Great to be here. It's particularly great because we're in the eye of the storm right now, because it is all happening on several fronts, as you know. And one of the reasons I'm only here for 15 minutes and can't answer all the wonderful questions that I enjoy answering so much is because we've got an oral statement on the whole of welfare reform later today. I don't know why they do it both in the Commons and the Lords, so you get a double dose. As you all know, the Coalition has put welfare reform right at the heart of the political agenda. And you heard last week from the Prime Minister that these changes are going to have a major impact on the country. And I know everyone here is really interested in exactly the shape of those changes. What we're really talking about is, at a national level, is setting an entirely new welfare contract with the British people. And that change is designed to raise the aspirations of millions of people, as well as tackling welfare dependency, intergenerational poverty, and a host of other social handicaps at the same time. Now, the need for reform, I think, is both urgent and pretty obvious. It's obvious because we are looking at a legacy of welfare failure. There are now 5 million people stuck on out-of-work benefits. 1.4 million, nearly 1.5 million, have been receiving out-of-work benefits for 9 of the last 10 years. 1.9 million children live in workless homes. And given where we are with the deficit, this is putting real pressure on us all. The working age welfare budget, I'm including both benefits and tax credits in that, has risen 40% in real terms. It was 63 billion in 1996-7, and it's now 87 billion in the current year. And as you all know, as George Osborne said last week, the fiscal deficit has left us paying interest payments of £120 million every single day. That's the case for reform. It's clear, it's unequivocal. What you're interested in is the next stage, which is delivery. The first thing we did or announced is press ahead with the long overdue housing benefit reform, which is designed not just to save money, but to promote fairness in the system, and really to clear up a system that allowed people who did not work to live in homes that working families simply couldn't afford. It's also the same reason that we launched the Universal Credit last July in the 21st Century Welfare Paper, a reform designed to deliver clearer, simpler incentives to work. And that is why we're introducing next year a work programme to operate alongside the migration from incapacity benefit onto the new employment support allowance. That's a migration that I'm sure hasn't escaped anyone's notice. We have the pilots in Burnley and Aberdeen starting today. We want to provide tailored support for people to make that journey back toward the workplace. So the migration, based on people on incapacity benefit being reassessed were put to one side, or put to an end the old one-size-fits-all approach that led to what are now 2.1 million people with health conditions and disabilities being trapped on benefits. It's been very expensive having that particular regime. It's cost us £135 billion over the last decade. More importantly, probably, it's led to a massive loss of skills and talent to this economy. So from today, that's going to change. The new approach to the work capability assessment is designed to discover what people can do rather than what they can't do. We will continue to provide help for people who can't support themselves, and we'll be in a better position to target support for those who can contribute through the employment support allowance. And this marks a real progress from the old regime that did leave so many people on benefits. Now, clearly the work programme is the point at which many people in this room come in. We're working on the finer detail of this scheme, but by now I hope many of the questions that you had when we first announced these reforms are being answered. The core principles remain exactly the same. They are that there's greater freedom for providers to provide the support that individuals need under a new commercial framework. It's a scheme where the payments are based on results and where we ensure that high delivery standards are matched with value for money for the taxpayer. And it's a program that combines the financial muscle and professionalism of the prime contractors with the voluntary faith sector's expertise to help people back the path for sustainable work. The new work programme represents a huge opportunity. Instead of a rigid, centralised system, we'll be asking you as providers to demonstrate that you have the professionalism, the expertise and the creativity to deliver for our customers. This is your chance to show that the market can deliver more than just a price discovery mechanism. It can actually drive innovation and be an engine of creativity. And if that does not happen, frankly, I am going to burn all of my first editions of Adam Smith. I do think that the black box approach as it's being dubbed will build far more efficient and effective delivery for those who need our help. As such, those with local and specialist knowledge will be in a good position to get involved as key players in each of the consortia. Meanwhile, the larger groups will be able to offer economies of scale, business acumen, and a global perspective on the solutions. That has the potential to be a powerful combination. When we score tenders, we will focus very closely on how the bids match these skills to provide the best results for the customer. The Merlin standard will also be in place to help large and small organisations work together more effectively in the longer supply chains that this system fosters. Let's not forget also that with the big society bank backing up the offer, we will champion the interests of the small and medium-sized players in the competitive market. The new work programme will launch next year, but given the clear direction of travel, I'm sure you're already having conversations with your client base today about how much they can make a change for the better tomorrow. because alongside the work programme, we're introducing probably the biggest single change to the benefit system that there's been since it was originally created. That is why the 21st Century Welfare Paper that we produced in July is so important. The universal credit gets us straight back to the basics of what the welfare system is supposed to be about. It gets rid of the perverse barriers that make work unattractive for millions of people by introducing a single taper that takes people into work and out of the benefit system. It's a far simpler system. It means that we can reduce administration costs, we can reduce fraud, we can reduce error. But it also helps your clients too, in that you can tell them it is always worth you going to work. It's always worth you taking that job. And with that message going out, we will go a long way towards helping people escape endemic worklessness, lack of aspiration, and intergenerational poverty. So let me finish up. Universal credit, new work programme, and the incapacity benefit migration will create a better welfare system for millions of people. This is nothing less than a transformation that will help us do three things: fight poverty, support the most vulnerable, and break the cycle of benefit dependency that has blighted communities up and down this country. And you people in this room are at the heart of this revolution. I hope you will join with this government, coalition government, delivering a prize that will transform the lives of millions of people, providing people with a clear route of benefits back into work, and indeed towards a Britain backwards. Thank you very much. I apologise, I would love to have answered questions, but it's a hell of a day. So.
Thank you, David. Once David actually did say that he'd eat his hat if he didn't deliver a AME-DEL AME switch. Well, he hasn't had to eat his hat, so let's hope, market players, that he won't have to burn his first editions of Adam Smith. I bet he hasn't really got first editions of Adam Smith. Maybe he does, maybe he does, yes, maybe he does. Okay, let's move smartly on. And we're next going to hear from Richard Johnson, who's the Managing Director of Serco Welfare to Work, and specifically going to be looking more around the issue of how a work programme should be financed.
And in 5 or 10 minutes, it's a rather complex area to cover in too much detail, but I hope that I will be able to highlight some of what I think are the key challenges that we face over the next 3 to 6 months if we are to get this right. And getting it right, I think, is vitally important. Neil said in his introduction, this is one of the most exciting areas of policy reform. I think it is for two reasons. One is that unemployment sits at the heart of social exclusion, and employment sits at the heart of well-being for individuals, their families and their communities. And the second is around this AME-DEL switch. This is all around David's hat. This is the financing stroke funding challenge that we face. And I actually think that what is proposed in this AME-DEL switch, or the social impact bonds being another variant of it, is potentially a fundamental shift in the relationship between the state and the state purse, between the payment of the services and the delivery of those services themselves. What we're aiming to achieve through moving to this AME-DEL switch, and I'll unpick that slightly in a minute, is to take the savings from expenditure that we would have seen in the future and bring those savings forward in order to invest in different service delivery up front. But we can't do that
within the rigours of public sector financing. We cannot put at risk tomorrow's benefit spend, which is what is called the AME budget. We have to keep that safe in case we need to pay it out in benefits. So how then can we tap into that pot of potential expenditure? The answer, as David suggested and proposed in his report some 3 years ago, was to bring in the private sector, to in turn bring in financing, to cover the upfront investment, to deliver the early days of service delivery, in order to then generate, to demonstrate an evidence saving in that benefit pot from which they could then be recompensed, from which the investment could then be repaid. This is not actually anything to do with, it's obviously to do with the welfare to work market, but this is not about changes to the welfare to work market per se. This is about the creation of a new market to sit above welfare to work provision with the specific objective of bringing in this investment to shift that relationship between the state and the service delivery. To get us from a position that we currently have where we pay for the inputs or the people starting on the programme or things that we believe might ultimately lead to them achieving employment outcomes, to shift from that to payments linked purely to the objectives that we want to pay for. In this instance, those objectives being individuals moving from long-term unemployment into long-term sustained employment. Of course, we have to get the funding mechanism right. One of the things that is being considered right now is that there will be differential funding, funding being the money paid to the contractor by the department. There may be differential funding determined by differences in the job seekers accessing the programme. So someone coming from job seekers allowance to the programme would come with a smaller amount of money attached to their head than someone coming from long-term incapacity benefit. It makes sense, I suppose, in that in theory the individual coming from long-term incapacity benefit is going to be more expensive to assist back into employment. The danger is, of course, that we will effectively limit the amount of money that is spent on people on JSA, and will design a system which is creaming and parking by its very nature because of that differential pricing. The financing, as in the money that we want to bring in to enable us to create this switch from upfront funding to payment on the basis of outcomes, is relatively easy to raise. Essentially, we are selling future receivables. So we are determining, we are defining what that future income stream might be, and we are selling that future income to our financiers up front. There is, however, a problem, and that is a lot of the information around that future receivable stream is currently unknown. We don't have data on how, particularly, the long-term incapacity benefit group are going to perform on this programme, how many of them we will enable to move from unemployment into employment. So we have to come up with a learning contract of some sort. We have to come up with a funding mechanism which is going to learn over time and change as we gather the data and as we learn how these different groups are going to perform, and as potentially we ride some of the storms that John was describing earlier. In order to define a learning contract, we have got to throw out some of the orthodoxies of current procurement practice. We cannot run this competition on the same basis as we've run competitions in the past. We must, for starters, right now be having a conversation between potential contractors, potential financiers, and the department and the treasury. We've got to bring those three together. We cannot wait until the competition is over. We have got to introduce a different level of transparency into this. Right now we have very, very little performance data on how organisations are delivering welfare to work services. The Department for Work and Pensions simply does not publish this information. We must know who is starting on what programme where and with what degree of success. We are, after all, this year spending 2.4 billion or so on outsourced welfare to work provision without knowing where that money is being effectively spent. We probably have to introduce some sort of common IT system in order to enable this to happen, and we almost certainly will have to have open book accounting. We will have to be able to understand what is being spent where, with, as I say, what degree of success. And determining that future receivable will probably have something to do with capping in some way the profits that the contractors are able to generate and or the losses that they may be able to suffer. If we don't get this three-way dialogue going, if we allow this new market to become absorbed back into the old market and for personal interests to take over, if we lose sight of these important outcomes that we are purchasing and therefore should be attaching our payments to, then we will have market failure. And we may have that market failure in November, December of this year. Thank you.
There's some very serious challenges there. David Freud wanting a creative, innovative market, but Richard Johnson suggesting that unless those details, those incredibly important details around which decisions are being taken now, unless that's got right, then there's a risk of market failure. We're going to move straight on to take our last speaker, and then hopefully there'll be an opportunity for Q&A to the whole panel at the end. So Martin, do you want to talk about the opportunities and challenges for delivery of the work programme?
Thanks David, and good afternoon everybody. The last time I spoke on this subject was in Liverpool, and I welcome very much what Adam Sharples, the Director General at DWP, said the day before about the work programme. He said, this is work in progress, we're trying to shape this, and very importantly, we need to test after it's started as we go along, and we need to start and continue the dialogue. This very much mirrors what Richard just said. I entirely agree with that. This approach is very unusual, and I think it reflects a number of things. The seriousness with which this long-term approach by government is taking towards welfare reform. The importance of making it work, or another way of putting it, the risk of failure, is very high if we don't get this right. The cost or potential cost, the transition from where we are to where we want to get to. The devil is in the detail here. There is a whole infrastructure out there delivering now, delivering very well, in my view. FND isn't that different to the work programme. The funding and the scale is, and the ambition is, but in terms of the experience of the long-term unemployed person, I would contend that it isn't that different. It's working really well in some parts. So the country needs delivery infrastructure for it to start working in April and July next year. But most of all, I think he said those words because of the complexity of the change. I was actually put on the spot on June the 10th when the work programme was announced in the ministerial statement in the House by my colleagues at Inclusion. And I said a number of things, mostly supported, but I also said they made it clear they value the high-performing parts of the infrastructure, and that's good. However, if too many variables are changed at the same time, and we get a different result from the experiment, sorry for the word, but I did a science degree at university a long time ago, it will be unclear what variant affected the change. For example, I gave a few examples, longer periods of sustained employment, a new financial structure, a different geography, and I could have said a different client group. And I actually blame our very adversarial political system for the level of change, some of which is entirely unnecessary from where we are. And some of you guys in Policy Exchange may have been looking for the clear blue water that was there under FND. So, for example, I remember meeting Theresa May in the House of Commons, who thought it was awful that people had to wait a year before they went on any programme. We can all kind of agree with that. So everyone was going to start 6 months, and I said, well, can you afford that? And now we know they might start 18 to 24, but I also know the Treasury is saying, well, 18 to 24 at 6 months, isn't there a lot of dead weight there? So it'll be interesting to see how that debate with Treasury goes. However, that's democracy, so fair enough. On the issue of sustainability, I've been doing this for a long time, and I do not believe we need to measure 1 year, 2 year, 3 year in employment to judge whether the interventions we've had with those individuals means they're sustaining back into employment. However, to make AME-DEL work, we do need it. Because if we're going to invest in this, we've got to fund the provider. That funding has got to come from the benefits that are saved. So I think it's as much about the mechanism funding as opposed to the ideology that you need to measure at 3 years. Chap asked earlier about creating jobs. These programs don't tend to create jobs unless they're targeted at specific industries, and we could do more of that. What they do is fill vacancies from people who've been unemployed for a very long time. I remember talking to a Tory minister in 1994, I think it was, Patrick McLaughlin, and later on Anne Widdecombe, she was in the Department of Employment, and they openly said, I think it's fine that these programs are as much about getting long-term people back into the labour market and recycling, so you don't end up with a very hardcore level of the same people unemployed later on. So, and the chap earlier talked about the NEET group, and I'm going to talk about that too. So on sustainability, yeah, we are going to do this at 1, 2, 3 years, etc. But that's to make the funding work, to get the adequate return from the risk. So that's why I welcomed what Adam Sharple said. And it's why Lord Freud, he didn't say it today, he talks about a soft start. And Lord Freud isn't like a lot of politicians. I remember talking to him, as I'm sure lots of you have, when in opposition, but not long before the election. And he talked about the short term and then said 5 years. Most politicians think short term is the latest headlines. And these guys really are trying to do the right thing and planning for the long term. Getting the pricing right and the funding mechanics is absolutely crucial. And just as an aside, it's going to be sad, sad, sad. And what I mean by that is, have you heard of spreadsheet-aided disaster? We've all done that. The figures aren't quite stacking up in all the modelling that everyone's doing at the moment. So what happens is, particularly when you've got, you talked about finances coming in, we won't know much about any of this. Say, well actually, the IB client at 3 years is worth £10,000. If we have 10% more of those, that'd be fine. 5% more JSA at 2 years, and let's shave 2% off the salary bill. Bob's your uncle, the number in the bottom right hand corner is right. So this is a sort of jokey way of saying, I agree with Richard, we really need to have a sophisticated approach to this. So it's very easy to kid ourselves when we predict the future about outcomes, particularly as there's no data. But it's why when the work programme contracts are let, you call them learning contracts, I've called them evolutionary. We didn't share notes. Either development contracts, learning contracts, or evolutionary contracts. This really needs to happen. That's why I quoted Adam Sharple, he is the Director General. That's what they said they do. If they do procure in the normal way, with strict, rigid, very difficult to make things change unless you go through a very formal change control process, I don't think it'll work either. So you need a continued dialogue with the DWP, and you need a good forum of deliverers. And that's quite difficult to do sometimes in the competitive market. I'm the chairman of Association of Learning Providers. We've got over 500 members, and it's quite difficult getting them all to agree. So welfare reform under this government is very brave, it's radical, it's challenging, it'll take time. As will the work programme. To prove it's better than what existed before, I believe it'll actually take 2 terms of government. Success will be given a much better chance if we all agree that we should test as we go along, start and continue the dialogue to repeat again what Adam Sharple said. A word or two on the black box, something I absolutely believe in. Another way of putting it is letting the people who know how to do this design, develop, continuously improve the delivery models and the results. With this freedom does come responsibility on the part of the delivery infrastructure. And there's a huge parallel with what's going on in the simplification of the funding system on skills. And we really must, as a provider community and DWP, not let any of our number get away with abusing that freedom. For example, the personalisation agenda. Is it really going to happen under a black box? There's a big trust element here, and we need to kind of police ourselves. But we also need to make sure that risk is managed. And in my view, therefore, standards like Merlin, an improved version of it, like Merlin, are really important, as is the provider assurance review, which is a really good risk control measure, value for money measure. They need to stay. And to be honest, it gives the best of us a real competitive advantage. and sets a benchmark for DWP about what can be delivered. Something about the framework. At ALP, we've been arguing for a preferred supplier regime since 2000 when the LSE was coming in. We actually gave a paper, presented it to Sir Brian Sanderson, the first chairman of the LSE. I've sent it recently to Alan Cave, it's still current. For those of us who've worked in other industries, it's a real no-brainer. Because the framework is a way of setting up a supplier list. It's a no-brainer as long as you win, by the way. So that's why I'm delighted that we've gone down the framework route. And there's a lot of benefits, not just faster commissioning. It's actually a more competitive situation in a very fragmented market. It's more transparent, it can be more transparent than a very fragmented market. And David Freud talked about innovation and creativity. It's much more likely to come if there's a good dialogue with preferred suppliers who work well with the supply chain and partners. This large provider versus localism thing, in my own experience, I can talk about that. We have over 60 locations in Kent, Surrey, Sussex, through 16 partners. It's more than Job Centre Plus have ever had to refer to in the past, and we're the prime contractor. It can work, and it can work very well at the local community level. And actually, I think it only really does work if you have a prime sub-model. I don't necessarily agree with Richard that there has to be another layer on top. I don't know what it means. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think some of us who deliver, we, for example, subcontract at 80%. Why do we keep that 20% direct delivery? Because it's different to sort of model that some large providers do. So we use it as a test bed, a hot house for continuous improvement, innovation, the base from which we find out the best practice from all the different partners, bring it back and send it right out again. It's a hub and spoke system, and it really does work. So one of the things I talked about at Liverpool also was the extra opportunity created by the framework, where both government, departments and local authorities can access framework providers for other things. And this is something David Freud's asked us to promote, because obviously they're very busy. I think it's a great idea. To take the NEAT group, which I talked about earlier, we do not deal with the NEAT group very well at the gap between 16 and 18. 16, 17, they come under local authorities, the Young People's Learning Agency. As soon as they become 18, it goes to DWP. When I was running Entry to Employment, that 16-year-old programme, which is a really good programme, there was no join-up, there still isn't. When IDS was interviewed on the Today programme, quite a few months ago now, so we forgive him for the technical knowledge, there was a question about 16, 18-year-olds. And so the question that said, or the guy in the BBC said, will this work programme solve that problem? He said, yes, it will. It won't. It doesn't start at 16 or 17, it starts at 18. And I think we really should look at how we tackle the NEET group, because that is the group that is actually sticking in unemployment, and we could build up this problem of a lot of people been unemployed for a long time. So there's been very little join up there. In conclusion on the work programme, I think your attitude to risk depends on your confidence level. If, like my organisation and the others, this is what you do, this is your raison d'etre for existing, I don't think it appears frightening at all. In fact, I think it's extremely exciting. If you put customers and employers at the heart of what you do, and you sort out the finances, which I do agree with Richard, shouldn't be that difficult in terms of confident levels of returns, in terms of outcomes, depending on the funding mechanism, I think the opportunity is greater than it's ever been. Thanks very much for listening.
The bad news is that we're going to have some time for Q&A. There's bad news because we've still got people standing at the back. So the good news is that we'll try and wrap this up by about 2:15 and let people move on their way. So any questions, responses to what you've heard today? Yep, Neil?
I have a question which is really about triage and about the relationship between providers and job centres. So, and the point's been made already that it's very expensive to give people well-placed work services. And it looks to me like there will be some element of triage in the system. If you've been one of Lord Freud's 1.4 million people who've been out of work for 9 out of 10 of the last years, you're not just going to be treated like everyone else in the system. There will be some attempt to fast track you, based on your previous track record, into welfare to work services. So I wondered, firstly, what you thought about triage. Secondly, whether you think it will happen. And lastly, there's another question which is about your relationship with job centres. You often hear of people who've spent 6 months on JSA, for example, still not got their CV together, still not really got their work expectations right. Obviously, the success rate for the providers is going to depend a lot on the kind of people and the preparation of the people who come to you. What's your kind of view on all of that?
Okay, Richard, do you want to?
On triage, Neil, it is the holy grail of welfare to work systems around the world that you should be able to identify on day one of unemployment the individual who is still going to be there after 1, 2 or 10 years, because that's the individual that you want to fast track onto your program. It is the holy grail because no one has found it. And generally the assumptions that people make about the indicators of someone's long-term unemployment are simply assumptions and not necessarily founded on the facts of that individual's reality. Though I'm not necessarily sure you were referring to triage in that way, because you were suggesting that individuals could be fast-tracked on the basis of their previous history on benefit, which at the moment I think is all that is being proposed, and that there will be some recognition of what had happened to you before, and that then will attach differential pricing to you when you enter the work programme. As I say, the danger there is that we limit the amount of money then attached to some individuals in order to increase it for others.
John, can we get smarter at spotting people that need more support and less support?
I don't think, I think Richard's absolutely right. People have spoken about this for years. I remember going to seminars where people try to sell models to DWP for identifying this, and it was always shown to be pretty ropey. So I'm not convinced about that. I suppose the only thing that would worry me is that if the work capability assessment is too tough, there might actually be some individuals who need real triage when they appear at the job centre because they'll be so sick that they won't be able to work. But that's a joke aside.
Did you want to add something, Buzz?
Yeah, on the point about when we get those people, on FNDL work programme, as I understand it, if it does start 1 year after signing on until their JSA now rather than 99B, the target should be that there's no more than 8% of those people who enter. And it varies between about 8 and 14 around the country. I think where we are at the moment is about 13%. And yes, they haven't managed to get them a job. We're not too worried actually about how well they've been prepared, given that we've now got them. It's annoying for the individual if you start again and ask all the same questions, and you do want as good a communication as you can get. But we like to basically, under this mandatory programme, create really good customer service culture and treat them quite differently, those people, to what they've experienced so far.
Okay.
And it certainly is working.
Let's have 2 quick comments. Yeah.
The companies supplying government have been making supernormal returns on their capital for the last decade. Good companies, but making really good returns. Running into this, obviously the government is now saying, right, you can make your money out of your savings. The companies seem to be saying, no, if it's like that, we won't do it. Richard just floated a really interesting idea, which was they can make good returns, but with capped profits and capped losses. How receptive do you think government is to that, please?
Okay, and then we'll take that one final comment up at the back. Question, and then we'll wrap up with final contributions from the panel.
What do the panelists think is the likelihood that the government will follow through and stick to the formal terms of engagement in which if you don't participate in your required activity, your benefits will be reduced or terminated? And is that essential?
Okay. Richard, do you want to fire off on both or either?
Yeah, I'll do the first one, Dave. I think the returns have varied depending upon the organisation involved and the service that they have been delivering. In terms of are they receptive to the cap losses and profits, I would say that I'm proposing those very much in the context of outcome-based funding, in this mechanism in which we shift the payment to these long-term outcomes. And we need that cap as an element of the learning contract and in order to protect this future receivable income. So actually what we're determining is a future return, and we cap how big or how low that return can come. Whether they're receptive to it on a wider basis, I think.
Martin?
Well, on your point, Jason, it seems like the government are very clear about their welfare reform agenda. We just heard from David Freud that it is going to be a step change. Having said all that, I don't think what you're saying is will they stop the benefits if we don't take a job and so on. It'd be a shame if that's what we had to use as the main incentive to work. And we don't feel we need that actually. Some individuals, sure, but I think it's a real minority, even within very long-term employment.
And John?
I mean, on the first question, I'll just be interested to see over time how, essentially how squeezed organisations along the supply chain whether there'll be a sort of element of, the big regional contractors, actually almost operating a bit like supermarkets with regard to smaller suppliers, and how that pans out will actually probably be quite important for how this works, because I think it's the supply chain organisations that actually know more about what they're doing, but they're also the ones that realise that it's not always easy to do this stuff on the chip, so how that pans out. Interesting. On the, I mean, Dave will know that after years of discussion that I've always been a sort of hawk on conditionality. I think it's always been an important part of the welfare system. Wasn't implemented well enough for too long, and has gradually been increased over time quite appropriately. I think it is something that needs to be sort of used quite strongly. But what's interesting is that sort of listening again to the sort of specialist providers, they accept that there are people that play the system, but what they're quite keen to do is to determine how they apply the conditionality, and rather than have it as a kind of sort of blanket rule, that they should be able to flex it depending upon the whites in the eyes of the individual that they see.
Okay, well, unless there are any other sort of burning questions or comments, I think that we ought to wrap this up by first of all thanking you for coming today, and also thanking the speakers that have laid out so ably what is very clearly the appetite to deliver the work programme, but with recognition that we really do need to be getting it right over the long term, and the only way that we're going to do that, I think what has come out very clearly, is either a learning or an evolutionary contract and relationship with central government. And that has to be done through a good dialogue. It's the dialogue not just about contracts, or as David Freud put it, discovering the market price, but also a dialogue that really does pick up on best practice, actually learns what really does actually help people get into work and stay there. Thank you very much for coming.